excuse me, we really started looking at these issues last week in terms of the strange fruit that you got a chance to watch the first part of it. I remember what I was trying to do with that was to set up not just a kind of chronological reading of African American history in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and afterwards, but also a sort of thematic reading. We can now do more thematic readings of some of the major themes in African American history and American history because we've done so much groundwork about chronology. We know sort of what comes next and what's happening. The themes that we were trying to look at and that I wanted to emphasize were culture and politics. I mean, really particularly thinking about the intersection of culture and politics. We normally think of culture and politics as two separate things. I wanted to sort of push you really the opposite direction. Think about the kind of the direct connections between culture and politics. So the Strange Fruit song and that biography of that song is actually really useful for us for many different reasons. But one of the reasons is because it specifically links culture and politics. This is a very political song, right? It's not just a cultural production, song that comes out and becomes this bestseller, seems to affect this African American imagined community in this time period because of its subject matter, right? It's all about lynching. Folks know what it's about, and so when they hear it, they automatically made a certain connection to it. But it also is going to enable several of the next things that we want to be looking at. That first part of the video begins to elaborate on how African Americans and other Americans are going to begin to make alliances, in particular blacks and whites, radical whites on some levels, right? Like the one who actually wrote the song, are going to begin to come together in a very political way. What you should be thinking about and sort of predicting the future is the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is going to be an interracial movement of people of color and white Americans that felt like there was something wrong with their society. And perhaps some of the first ways they begin to make these connections, maybe that's through culture. Maybe a song like Strange Fruit enables this to happen maybe more rapidly than it might have happened otherwise. Who knows? What I want to do is really think about the significance of the cultural significance of culture and the political significance of culture. So again, as always, we're doing multiple things at the same time. We're sort of doing chronology, right? What happens this year and that kind of stuff. But again, we're never most interested in that. We're really interested in significance. Harlem Renaissance obviously is a perfect case study for this. A perfect case study for thinking about culture and politics at the same time. I jumped ahead a bit in showing you that first half of the Strange Fruit because in some ways this comes later, chronologically speaking. Right? Most of what you saw in the video was in the 30s, and actually into the 40s and 50s, and the second half of the video traces it all the way up to the present, and really kind of asks the question, why are so many artists still kind of infatuated with this song, Strange Fruit, and with the phenomenon of lynching? They show probably 50, 60 plus, bless you, artists that have sung that song, their own kind of rendition of it. I played a couple of examples from the kind of hip-hop community, Lupe Fiasco and the Kanye West, the Blood on the Leaves and the Strange Fruition that specifically kind of sample that idea in that song too. Maybe that's the first question. Why are people still interested in this song? It's 2015. You could even ask at the time, why were folks interested in this song in the 1930s and 40s and 50s when Billie Holiday popularized it? When we talked about lynching way back in the 1880s, 1890s. But why do you think people might be still interested in a song like this as we think about culture and politics and African American history?
Because back then it was still lynching was still going on,
Okay.
and now because lynching isn't so much of an issue now, but racism still is. So that song is still relevant today.
Okay. Good. So if lynching is not the same issue that it was and it was died out, these sorts of things. If lynching is this kind of example of racism, as you're stating, then if racism is still a problem, then the song still has some meaning. Interesting. It's interesting to me that people from various communities would be drawn to such a song. Maybe they all, in some respects, feel the same way that the idea that you just articulated, that problems of race and other problems, class and other things come up, gender, are still things that need to be dealt with. If lynching is gone, let's say, what might be a contemporary problem or parallel that people might be just as worried about today. What do we keep seeing in the news? Issues of police brutality, right? Or at least the question about it. This is really, again, another good parallel between past and present. When we talk about an organization like the Black Panther Party, for example, in the late 60s, they are formed specifically to combat police brutality in Oakland, California. And that's 1966. These guys come together and say, this is one of the first things we want to deal with, and ultimately found an organization around the issue. Yet, 50 years later, we still seem to be dealing with some of the same issues and concepts, right? It seems to be a constant kind of thing, this notion of sort of the demonization of certain groups by individuals we want to invest our trust in. And that's, I think, in some ways why it's so worrisome. It's one thing if one person kills another person, right? We almost, unfortunately, have come to expect people to do that. But when it's the system, they're seen as the system or law enforcement or one's government, right? It seems to take on an even larger sort of significance. So a lot of folks are going to be, we'll continue to talk about that issue. It remained an issue of the civil rights era. It was one of the major issues in the civil rights era, and obviously it's still a conversation today. It's still a conversation today. So again, think about how folks may respond to that culturally and politically. Culturally and politically. How do folks respond to violence? Right? That's been one of the kind of underlying questions in this class. To bring it back to one of your assignments from last week or so, Darlene Clark Hine makes the case that black women have responded to the threat of violence and violence in what perhaps are unique ways. And this may not be just limited to black women. Maybe she's making a larger case about women generally and how they've responded. So that article, it was a short article, but it's really an important one on the culture of dissemblance was something I really wanted you guys to work your way through. It looks like only a couple people have actually participated in the discussion board on it, but hopefully more than that have read it because it's important. And also I think it could have been helpful for those of you writing about that aspect of the Great Migration. She talks a lot about the Great Migration. That's kind of her case study of women, in a sense, is women leaving, particularly because of the threat of sexual violence and how they're going to respond to that. What is a definition of the culture of dissemblance? Somebody who read it. What is this culture of dissemblance she's talking about?
So the discussion board, when would you do?
Due today, actually, by class time, supposedly, so that we could discuss it a little bit in class. But I looked on the way in, it looked like only 2 or 3 people had gotten on there. So I'm not sure how many people have worked their way through it. Anybody that read it know what a culture of dissemblance is? Let's see if I can pull it up real quick. What I like about Darlene Clark Hine is she's a historian. She's still alive. She's seen as one of the founders of Black women's history. So much of her work has to do with not only race but gender, and in this case, class too, right? She's talking about particularly working women or women as workers and some of the things that they're going to deal with. So in that way, this kind of history is actually very important. And a lot of folks in various communities outside of the African American community have picked up on these themes. How might migrant workers, for example, especially migrant worker women, be dealing with some of these same issues that African American women had to deal with during the Great Migration, getting from one place to another safely by finding a job without being abused and keeping that job without being abused or taken advantage of. I mean, these are, in some ways, ideas that have expanded, obviously, outside of just this one community. I'll put the course marker too. She starts off, one of the things I like about her is she's pretty clear. Even though she's talking about some big ideas, she'll break it down for you, kind of like Tipping Point author Malcolm Gladwell would do. And she jumps right into it. There's not a whole bunch of build-up in her work. I'll show you the first page of her article if it opens up here. It's in a book she wrote called Hindsight. So the article is called Rape in the Inner Lives of Black Women, Thoughts on the Culture of Dissemblance. Again, we're thinking about this connection between culture and politics. She's saying that women have developed some sort of political culture because of the fact that they have to deal with almost the inevitability of violence. We live in a very violent society, especially where gender is concerned. It's interesting how she starts, though. I want to get your thoughts on this first page. And then she gets the definition really in the second full paragraph or so. She says, one of the most remarked upon but least analyzed themes in the history of Southern black women deals with black women's sexual vulnerability as victims of rape and domestic violence. Another subject pretty, popular in the news in the last year or so. Author Hazel Carvey put it baldly when she declared, quote, the institutionalized rape of black women has never been as powerful a symbol of black oppression as the spectacle of lynching. That's interesting. We spent a lot of time talking about lynching as kind of this quintessential violence, right, directed at the African American community. She's saying, look, we need to pay just as much attention to forms that were more prevalent towards women. Now, we did something a little different in this class. When we dealt with lynching, we focused not only on the lynching of black men, but we really spent some decent amount of time talking about the lynching of women and what that meant. Right? Historically, lynching was thought of as only being something that happened to men. So part of what she's responding here in this article, which I think is 1993, was that idea that we only focus on violence against men. Well, what about half the population of women? Hazel Carvey is another scholar, and she's still at Yale. She is also very interested in gender and women's issues. Rape has always involved patriarchal notions of women being, at best, not entirely unwilling accomplices. She's saying that indirectly we think of women as somehow asking for this type of violence or buying into it in some way because it is a patriarchal system. What does patriarchy mean? Remember that whole law of matrilineal descent, patrilineal. Essentially, it means a society where men are dominant, and how women have had to navigate that. The links between black women and, I can't read that part, illicit sexuality consolidated during the antebellum years had powerful ideological consequences for the next 150 years. So basically, stereotypes from before Reconstruction stay with us for the next 150 years. That's what she's saying. Now she's going to come up and give us a definition. I suggest that rape and the threat of rape influenced the development of a culture of dissemblance among Southern black women. By dissemblance, I mean, she's pretty clear, here's the definition, the behavior and attitudes of black women that created the appearance of openness and disclosure, but actually shielded the truth of their inner lives and selves from their oppressors. What's she saying? Somebody break that down for me. Behavior and attitudes of black women that created the appearance of openness, but actually shielded the truth of their inner lives. What do you think Darlene Clark-Hine is saying about this culture that black women have created? And do you agree?
She's saying like it made it seem like they was willing to do it or something like that.
Not exactly. Somewhat. I'd say somewhat. She's basically saying that, or anyone else? She's basically saying that women have this appearance of openness. You appear to be open books, but they're really hiding quite a bit. That you have to hide quite a bit of yourself in order to stay safe, essentially. Now, this isn't really the first time we've talked about this type of kind of culture. We talked about it when we talked about Du Bois. Right? The idea that there's a veil there, and there's black on one side and white on the other side, and that African Americans historically have learned to kind of hide part of themselves. I think that one of the examples I gave you was your phone rings and it's your friend from high school versus your phone rings and it's a job interview. How do you sound when you answer that phone? It may be quite different. You have to put on a professional voice for a job. That you have to portray yourself a certain way in order to get what you want. Get with your friends, you may not have to do that. You could actually be yourself in a sense. She's making this case about gender. That women in particular have had to hide or dissemble, to kind of hide things, maybe put on a mask, a face, in order to survive in this world. So again, this article is interesting because it's not just about race. Race as a problem. It's also about this question of gender and how experiences may be similar in some ways for women and how they may be different in some ways for women. So depending on what character, for example, you chose for your Great Migration essay, if it was a woman, you might have found some different things in terms of her motivations for coming. And a lot of this talks about not just economics as a motivation for people migrating, but fear of violence. I mentioned this in terms of lynching. A lot of folks are saying, look, lynchings are happening, we need to get out of here. She's going to focus on particularly women's emphasis on sexual violence. Like, I got to get out of here. And she goes a step further. She says not only is the white male a threat, sexual threat, but black men too. Women were sometimes, raped by black men too in the South. And so seeking opportunities in the North might not just be about race. It might be about gender, it might be about economic opportunity, it might be about some other things. So it's interesting to think about that, and then she's going to test this theory using several women that migrate. So if you haven't read this, you should. It's actually very, very useful for us. We can use it also, I think, to talk about culture again. What sorts of things are artists going to put out there in their cultural production, in their songs, and their paintings, and their short stories? What should, quote unquote, the black artist write about, and what should they not write about? There's a whole debate about this in the Harlem Renaissance. Whole debate about this. In some ways, maybe that underlies the explosion of cultural production that would be the Harlem Renaissance. You have people like W.E.B. Du Bois that's still active on the scene. People like George Schuyler, Elaine Locke, Langston Hughes, that are going to really go at each other in terms of answering that question. What is the black artist and what is black art? It was a specific question that got asked and answered, in part at least, in this period. So if you look at the course module 3 and in the Harlem Renaissance materials, you'll see some extra materials that relate to that question. There's a short article by W.B. Du Bois, Criteria of Negro Art, where he gives his definition. There's a short poem by Claude McKay, which I'm going to point out here in a second. And there's reference to this debate. Right? Some say black artists don't have to do anything different. Right? If you're an artist, you're an artist. Your only loyalty is to your art. You portray whatever you think your art should portray. Others say, nah, you live in a society that is different because of race in particular, so you have a responsibility to portray certain things to help the race. Right? You have to produce race art. Again, some artists are going to really draw back from that. Say, wait a second, white artists don't have to do that. Right? They don't have to talk about any particular thing. Right? An artist can talk about whatever. Why is it then that a black artist must, either portray a kind of middle class picture of African Americans, going to church or doing something quote unquote positive? Why can't they portray whatever they want to portray? What if they choose to portray the black gangsters or the kind of underside of gambling in Harlem, or write a story about a black prostitute? Well, someone like Du Bois is going to say, well, you're just feeding into the stereotypes that are already existing about African Americans. You really need to think about this. And technically, there's some truth to that, but that artist can say, look, that's not my issue. If I'm completely defined by a society that doesn't consider me equal anyway, I'm only limiting myself in my art. A lot of these debates are kind of underlying the production that's going to come out of this Harlem Renaissance. Artists, are never completely separated from their historical context. Right? They're living in a certain moment. And I'll give you an example of that here. They're responding to both positive and negative things in their societies. Yet, should they be limited to that? Should they be limited? Aren't artists the ones that can kind of go beyond that? If anybody can, right? Us that just make it to work every day, maybe we can't escape it in a way that an artist is supposed to be able to escape kind of the limits of the confines of their everyday life. Yet, they are connected in some way to their time period. I want you to look at this real quick. Claude McKay. Claude McKay is a good example. It's often used to kind of epitomize much of this art coming out of the Harlem Renaissance. Much of this art coming out of the Harlem Renaissance. We can think about historical context, but we can also think about what he's doing artistically and how he's making a certain political statement with his cultural production. Claude McKay is a Jamaican immigrant. He comes to this country. So he's familiar with colonialism, British colonialism in the Caribbean. He's also going to be familiar and walk right into a Harlem Renaissance, race riots, problems of race and violence here in the United States. In 1919, he puts out this poem, a very famous poem now, called If We Must Die, in direct response to the bloody summer of 1919. There's all these race riots going on. How does he respond? As an artist, he says, I'm going to produce art. he writes this poem called "If We Must Die." And you'll notice certain things in this poem. One of the reasons why it's often focused on is because of its form, like how it's constructed. You English majors will be able to break this down much better than I could. Poets even better. But also its content. Right? Form and content are going to be significant for Mr. Claude McKay as he's responding to this violence around him. So it's interesting, the form, say something about the form. The form of this poem is sort of the traditional kind of Shakespearean sonnet. Right? Sounds like a black Shakespeare right here. But the content of it is very specific, very kind of new Negro, very militant. Right? And we talked about the kind of getting rid of the old Negro. It's a more militant, manly sort of response and how folks should respond. Let's go through it really quickly. If we must die. It says, if we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. What do you get from that? What sort of message is Claude McKay sort of giving to this generation of new Negroes and how they should respond to the context around them? What strikes you? Don't.
Not to settle, basically.
Don't settle? Okay. Be satisfied. Settle for what?
Basically.
Hey, I think you definitely could interpret it that way. Don't settle for anything. He's being specific here, but you could make a larger case about it.
I think you're saying, that was, like God, that was dignity, courage. Like how some people say, like, if I'm a die, I'm gonna go out with a bang. Like, I'm
Okay.
known for what I'm doing. Like, do something that's gonna make a difference
Okay.
rather than just being existent.
Okay. Yeah, some folks say, look, everybody lives, or everybody dies. Some people never truly live. Is an interesting quote, right? That if you don't make a mark, are you really contributing anything? In this case, he makes it perhaps a kind of, imagined community of African Americans or racial argument about that. Look, he's not saying you're going to win. He's not saying you're always going to win. He says you're outnumbered. All right, for their 1,000 blows, at least take one with you. Deal one death blow. Remember Ida Wells, 30 years earlier, said similar things, not in poetic form, but in journalistic form. She said, look, lynching wouldn't happen so much if y'all defended yourselves. She said, a Winchester rifle deserves a place of honor in every home. She said, next time the lynch mob shows up at your house, let him catch some shots. Now, again, her friends, Thomas Miles McDowell and Will Stewart, did just that. At their grocery store got attacked. It was a shootout. They were overwhelmed ultimately. They wounded some folks, and I forget if they killed one of the people. But she says, look, if you do that more often, then lynchings and this violence will happen less. Now, again, whether that's true or not, we could debate, but this is a very different approach. The Sambo does not respond this way. This is definitely a new Negro response. Marcus Garvey said the same types of things. He put part of the blame on the African Americans themselves. You guys weren't responding in manly ways, and so you're not being treated with the respect that you deserve. Remember Garvey said, for every one person they lynch in the U.S., lynch two in Africa. That's a very different message, a very different message than one might see in earlier generations. So this new Negro is, some would say, a different animal. Speaking of animal, it's interesting how often McKay uses animals in this. Right? He kind of describes white racists as animals. He also describes African Americans. Don't die like a hog. Right? If you want to be a human, then respond like one. Right? Let's bark the mad and hungry dogs. This sort of stuff is really interesting in terms of its cultural production. Right? In terms of its cultural production. So think again about culture and politics. Some people see this as sounding a new approach, a new standpoint for this new Negro generation. Now, the new Negro movement, Harlem Renaissance, people debate the actual dates of this movement, but generally it's from about World War I to really the outbreak of World War II. It does begin to decline once the Depression kicks in, right? We have this major Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in world history that hits Europe first and then comes to the U.S. In 1929, we had this stuff in class before, stock market crashes, right? Pretty soon you're going to have tremendous economic difficulties in this country for everybody, not just any one group. Everybody is going to struggle. By 1932, 1 in 4 people are unemployed. 1 in 4 people are unemployed by 1932, and more than that, other people are seeing their wages cut, their hours go down. They may be working a little bit, but not what they were. Suicide rates are at an all-time high. This is a rough, rough situation, and it does not end. Does not end until World War II begins. Until war production and another great migration is going to occur in response to this. In the early 1940s, so you get about a decade of just horrible circumstances. People starving, people losing their homes, kids selling apples. You see these pictures of kids selling apples for a nickel on the street and try to help feed themselves, to help keep them getting evicted from their homes or apartments. These sort of, it's a really difficult time. And with that is going to come a decline, or even what some see as kind of the end of the Harlem Renaissance. This raises some other issues too. We could talk about this more on Thursday. Why would that cause a decline in art? Why would an economic downturn of this proportion cause a decline in African American artistic production? Doesn't seem like they're mutually related, right? That art over here, that economics over here. Why would you think that would be?
Maybe because people, they wouldn't have enough money to publish new books or create new paintings or buy new materials something, or because like places like the cotton club would have struggled at that time to get new people coming back or to even stay in business.
Okay. Good. You hit two sides of it right there. First of all, think about what artists do. Right? In order to produce art, you need certain supplies, materials, depending on what your artistic choice is. If you're a painter, you need some canvas and brushes and paints, that kind of stuff. But even before that, you need to eat first, right? You talk about starving artists, artists that are willing to dedicate everything and maybe even go without meals in order to do what they need to do. But if you literally starve, you're not producing anything, right? Our first priority tends to be to survive. So from the artist's perspective, yeah, this depression is going to impact their artistic production. And this raises another issue. And you raised it, this idea of a kind of politics of publication. As we know, not every piece of art that's produced is going to see the light of day. We can think about this in terms of hip-hop today. What songs make the radio, what songs don't. Right? There's a politics to that. The right people, perhaps, maybe your song gets there quicker. The Harlem Renaissance is an interesting example of this because most of the people with money early on are going to be white patrons. A lot of this artistic production is being produced to be purchased by whites, by a white audience. And in addition to that, there are a number of patrons. There were whites, particularly in New York, that see someone like a Langston Hughes or Zerl Larry and say, you know what, you're a talented artist, I'm going to pay your salary. A patron is somebody that pays your salary, basically. So say, you're Langston Hughes working as a dishwasher. He says, no, you need to be writing poetry. You're obviously talented. I'll give you, $50 a month, whatever. I'll be your patron, and you just write. You just write. It's a nice gig if you can get it. There are several important white patrons in this period. So if they lose their money, it's not just them. It's going to impact all these other artists as well. But that raises some questions. Who is this art being produced for? Right? If you're producing for a certain audience, does that change the art? Again, we've raised this a couple of times in terms of thinking about things like hip-hop again. If you're writing something to be successful mainstream, you change it to kind of fit that. So this is part of how the economics will come into it. And it's also, I think, complicates the discussion about what is black art or Negro art that Du Bois and Langston Hughes and Locke and these other folks are going to be debating and discussing. Question? So think about how complicated this can become. Think about how sort of complex and complicated this might become in terms of this Renaissance. Let's see if this is working. I had some problems with this link earlier. It's a little 10-minute clip on overview of the Renaissance. Touch on some of the key ideas, some of the key figures. I want to use that, and then we'll use this to transition Thursday back into more specifics. We'll get back into the strange fruit, look at some blues women and how they would complicate this discussion, particularly around sexuality. This is a clip from a larger video that's actually in the Blackboard.
1910, Harlem was an upper middle class
that I point out.
white community.
This is Henry Louis
By
Gates.
1925, it was known as the Mecca of
The new Negro.
See some of the images.
African Americans came to New York, just as they did to many of the great cities of the North, seeking opportunity.